"Please, cut me down," he whispered, his voice barely rising above the dry wind that swept across the prairie. The pregnant woman reined in her horse so suddenly that the leather straps creaked in protest. The late afternoon sun burned low over the endless stretch of golden grass, painting the sky in deep shades of amber and rust. She had been riding for hours along the old frontier trail, the same lonely path settlers and warriors had crossed for generations. She thought she had imagined the voice at first. Out here in the American West, the wind often carried strange sounds, but then she saw him. He hung from the thick branch of a cottonwood tree at the edge of a shallow creek, his wrists bound high above him with rough rope. His boots brushed the bark not far from the ground, yet far enough to leave him helpless. His dark hair fell across his face, and dried blood traced a thin line down his temple. Even from a distance, she could see the strength in his broad shoulders and the proud set of his jaw. He did not look like a man ready to surrender to death. The woman, whose name was Serafina Vale, pressed a steady hand over her swollen belly as if to calm the restless life within. She was heavy with child, her long skirt dusted with miles of prairie dirt, her braided hair tucked beneath a worn bonnet. She had left behind the safety of her small homestead at dawn, determined to reach the nearby trading post before nightfall. Winter would soon claim the plains, and she needed supplies. She had not expected to find a warrior hanging between life and death. The land around them was silent, except for the murmur of the creek and the distant cry of a hawk. No horses waited nearby. No signs of the men who had done this lingered, though the broken grass and scuffed earth told a violent story. Whoever had strung him up had either been interrupted or wanted him to suffer slowly. Serafina swallowed hard. Out here, survival meant choosing caution over compassion. She knew the rules of the frontier. A lone woman, especially one carrying a child, could not afford reckless decisions. And yet something in his eyes when he lifted his head and saw her made her heart falter. They were not the eyes of a criminal. They were fierce, storm-gray eyes filled with pride and pain, and something else. "Hope, I won't harm you," he rasped, struggling against the rope just enough to show he still had strength left. "By the spirits of this land, I swear it." His voice carried the deep, steady rhythm of a tribal warrior. The beads woven into a thin leather cord around his neck glinted in the fading light. His buckskin shirt, though torn and stained, was finely crafted, marked with symbols of courage and honor. He was no outlaw drifter. He was a fighter of the old tribes, a protector of his people. Serafina had heard stories. The frontier was filled with them. Stories of raids and retaliation, of broken treaties and stolen land. But she had also heard other stories, quieter ones. Stories of warriors who defended their families with unshakable loyalty. Stories of men who valued honor above life. The child within her shifted again, and she winced softly. She should ride away. She should pretend she had never heard his plea. The trading post was still miles ahead and darkness was closing in. Wolves would soon begin their haunting chorus across the prairie. Yet her father's voice echoed in her memory, as clear as the day he had taught her to hold a rifle steady. "Mercy is never weakness," he had said. "It is the mark of the brave." She slid carefully from her horse, her boots touching the earth with quiet resolve. The warrior watched her every movement, not with suspicion, but with something almost like disbelief. "You should not be here," he murmured. "They may return." "Who did this to you?" she asked, her tone firm despite the tremor in her chest. "Men who fear what they do not understand," he replied. "Men who think this land belongs to them alone." A bitter truth lingered in the air between them. Serafina stepped closer, studying the knot above his wrists. It was pulled tight, cruelly tight. She could see where the rope had cut into his skin. He must have been hanging there for hours beneath the unforgiving sun. "Why?" she pressed. He hesitated, then met her gaze without flinching. "Because I would not give them what they wanted. And what was that?" "My loyalty." The word struck her with unexpected force. Loyalty. It was a rare thing in these divided lands. A distant rumble rolled across the prairie, not thunder hooves. Seraphine's heart pounded. She turned sharply toward the horizon. A thin cloud of dust was rising far off in the west. "Riders, they're coming back," the warrior said quietly. There was no fear in his voice now, only urgency. "If they see you with me, they will not spare you." She looked down at her belly, then back at him. The choice before her was heavier than the child she carried. Help him and risk everything. Leave him and carry the weight of his death forever. The riders were still far enough away that she had minutes, perhaps less. Please, he said again, softer this time, as if the strength was draining from him. Cut me down. The wind picked up, tugging at her skirt and whipping loose strands of her hair across her face. The prairie seemed to hold its breath. Serafina reached for the small knife she kept strapped to her boot. The blade was not large, but it was sharp, sharp enough to slice rope, sharp enough to change fate. She stepped close enough to see the steady rise and fall of his chest. Up close, she noticed the scar along his collarbone, the faint trace of a tattoo inked near his heart, the quiet dignity in the way he carried himself despite his suffering. "You have a name?" she asked suddenly. "Thunderhawk," he answered. It was a powerful name, fitting for a man who seemed carved from the very strength of the plains. "I am Serafina Vale," she said, almost without thinking. Their eyes locked, and something unexpected passed between them. Not just gratitude, not just desperation, something deeper, something that felt like the beginning of a story neither of them had planned. The sound of hooves grew louder. She raised the knife toward the rope, and just as the blade touched the coarse fibers, a sharp crack split the air behind her. A gunshot. The gunshot shattered the stillness of the prairie and sent a flock of blackbirds bursting from the cottonwood tree. Seraphine's breath caught in her throat. The knife trembled in her hand, still pressed against the rope binding Thunderhawk's wrists. She did not turn around at once. Fear moved slowly through her, cold and steady, but it did not freeze her. Another shot rang out, this one striking the trunk of the tree above Thunderhawk's shoulder, splintering bark into the air. "Step away from him," a voice thundered from across the creek. Serafina lowered the knife slightly and turned. 5 riders had reached the opposite bank, their horses stamping at the shallow water. At their front sat a broad-shouldered man with a dark duster coat flowing behind him like a shadow. His beard was thick, streaked with iron gray, and his eyes were sharp beneath the brim of a black hat. He carried his rifle with careless confidence. He did not look surprised to see her. He looked annoyed. "That's far enough, Mercy Kane," Thunderhawk said quietly, his voice steady despite the strain in his arms. So that was his name, Mercy Kane. The name felt wrong for a man who aimed a rifle at a pregnant woman without hesitation. Mercy Kane's gaze shifted to Seraphine's belly, then back to her face. "You picked a poor place to wander, ma'am," he called out. "That man is wanted. Dangerous. You'd do well to step aside and let justice finish its work." Justice. The word tasted bitter in the air. Serafina straightened her shoulders. The prairie wind tugged at her bonnet, but she did not flinch. "He doesn't look dangerous," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "He looks like a man tied to a tree." A few of the riders behind Kane shifted uneasily. One of them, a younger man with restless eyes and a scar cutting through his eyebrow, leaned closer to his leader. "She ain't part of this, Kane. Let her ride on." But Kane did not lower his rifle. Thunderhawk's eyes found Serafina again. There was no plea in them now, only warning. "They won't stop," he murmured under his breath. "Not if they think I still breathe." The creek water moved gently over smooth stones, indifferent to the standoff unfolding on its banks. The sky above had deepened to a burnished copper, shadows stretching long across the land. The American frontier had always been a place of hard choices and harder men, but tonight it felt like the edge of something greater, something that could not be undone. "Why is he wanted?" Serafina called out. Kane gave a dry laugh. He led a band that raided supply wagons bound for the rail line, stole rifles, medicine, food, claimed it was taken from his people first, as the land remembers who it belongs to. Thunderhawk did not deny it. Serafina felt the weight of those words. Railroad had been cutting through the plains for months now, her own tracks slicing across sacred hunting grounds, bringing settlers, soldiers, and lawmen. Her own late husband had once spoken of investing in it before fever took him the previous winter. The expansion promised progress, wealth, and order, but it also brought conflict. "My people were promised peace," Thunderhawk said, his voice carrying across the water. "Peace in exchange for trust. The promise was broken." Kane's jaw tightened. "You burned a freight cart." "I burned what was built on lies." The younger rider shifted again. "We could have brought him in proper," he muttered. "This ain't a trial." Kane shot him a sharp look. This is the frontier. Out here, we make our own law. Serafina felt the child within her press against her ribs, as if reacting to the tension. She placed a steady hand over her belly, grounding herself. She had not planned to become part of this conflict between railroad men and tribal warriors. She had only wanted flour, salt, and lamp oil. Yet here she stood, between a hanging warrior and armed riders. Her mind drifted back to her father, Gideon Vale, a former cavalryman who had settled on the prairie, seeking redemption for battles he rarely spoke of. He had taught her to ride before she could properly walk, taught her to read the land, to sense danger before it showed its face. He had also taught her that the truth was rarely simple. "Is there proof?" she asked Kane. "Proof he killed anyone?" Kane hesitated, just a flicker, but she saw it. "He's guilty enough," Kane replied. Thunderhawk's lips curved into a faint, weary smile. "You see," he said softly to Serafina, "how truth bends in the wind." The riders edged closer to the creek. Hooves splashed into the shallow water. Seraphine's heart pounded, yet beneath the fear was something else rising, a strange, fierce protectiveness. Not just for herself or her unborn child, but for the man hanging. Above her, she barely knew him, yet his strength, his loyalty to his people, stirred something deep inside her. Perhaps it was the loneliness she had carried since her husband's passing. Perhaps it was the hunger for something more than survival. Or perhaps it was simply that she recognized honor when she saw it. "Let him stand trial in town," she said boldly. "If he is guilty, let it be decided proper." Kane's eyes darkened. "And risk his tribe coming for him. Risk more bloodshed?" "No, ma'am. This ends here." The younger rider, whose name Thunderhawk had not spoken, but whose face betrayed doubt, lowered his gaze. His name, Serafina would later learn, was Iron Cole. He did not look eager for what was about to happen. The sun dipped lower, and the first chill of evening settled across the prairie. Seraphine's grip tightened on the knife. "If I walk away," she asked Thunderhawk quietly, "what will they do to your people?" "They will push them farther west," he replied. "Into land that cannot feed them. Into silence." His words were not dramatic. They were simple, heavy with truth. A gust of wind swept across the creek, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. In that moment, Serafina understood that this was no random encounter. The American West was changing, and she stood at the crossing of two worlds. The railroad and the old tribes, law written in ledgers and law written in blood memory, and somehow her life had become tangled in it. Kane raised his rifle again. "Last chance, ma'am. Step away." Serafina did not move. Thunderhawk's eyes softened as he looked at her. "You owe me nothing," he said. "Protect your child. That is your first loyalty." The word struck her again. Loyalty. She thought of the small farmhouse waiting for her return. Of the cradle half finished in the corner of her bedroom, of the quiet nights filled only with wind against the shutters. She thought of raising her child in a land ruled by fear instead of fairness. "No," she said, more to herself than to them. "Bye." The prairie seemed to lean in closer. Far beyond the riders, on a distant ridge, another shape appeared against the fading sky, a single horseman, watching. Serafina noticed him first. Kane had not yet seen. The figure remained still, silhouetted by the dying light, like a silent witness to the unfolding conflict. Thunderhawk's eyes flickered past her, and for the first time something like recognition crossed his face. The tension thickened, not easing, only shifting. And the rope above. Thunderhawk's wrists creaked under his weight as the next heartbeat of the frontier began to unfold. The lone rider on the ridge did not move, yet his presence changed everything. The fading light wrapped around him like a cloak, tall in the saddle, watching the standoff below as if weighing every soul caught in it. Thunderhawk's breathing shifted. Serafina felt it, before she saw it. A slight tightening in his shoulders, despite the rope that held him. Mercy Kane finally noticed the figure. His rifle dipped just a fraction as he glanced toward the horizon. "It seems we're gathering an audience," he muttered. Iron Cole followed his gaze, unease settling across his scarred face.
"That ain't one of ours."
"No," Thunderhawk said quietly. "He is not." Seraphine's pulse beat in her ears. The prairie that had once felt open and endless now seemed small, like a stage where too many players had stepped into the same scene. The American frontier thrived on power and fear, and tonight both were rising like a coming storm. The rider on the ridge began to descend slowly, not rushing, not hiding. His horse moved with calm precision down the slope toward the creek. As he drew closer, Serafina could see his long, dark coat lined with silver stitching, a rifle strapped across his back but untouched. His hair was bound at the nape with a strip of red cloth, and his expression held the quiet strength of someone who did not scare easily. "Storm Vance," Kane said under his breath, recognition sharp in his tone. The name carried weight. Even Serafina had heard whispers at the trading post of a man who rode between worlds. A tracker. A former scout. A man who knew both the tribal lands and the rail camps, yet claimed loyalty to neither. Storm Vance stopped his horse a few yards from the creek, studying the scene with steady eyes. "You've made quite a picture here, Kane," he called out. "A hanging without a judge. It's bold even for you." Kane's jaw hardened. "This is not your concern." Storm's gaze shifted to Thunderhawk, then to Serafina. His eyes lingered on her belly for a brief moment, not with pity but with calculation. "Seems to me it became my concern when you chose a public tree." The wind shifted again, cooler now. Night would not wait much longer. Serafina felt caught between forces larger than herself. Railroad expansion, tribal resistance, frontier justice. Each man before her stood for something different. Kane for order through fear. Thunderhawk for loyalty to ancestral land. Storm Vance for something less clear, perhaps balance, perhaps opportunity. Iron Coal cleared his throat. "We can end this clean," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "There's no need to draw more into it." Serafina turned slightly, her knife still hidden against her skirt. "Clean," she repeated softly. "There is nothing clean about a rope around a man's wrists." Thunderhawk looked at her with something deeper than gratitude now. It was admiration, quiet and steady. She felt it like warmth against the gathering cold. Storm Vance dismounted at last and stepped toward the creek, boots crunching against gravel. "Untie him," he said simply. Kane gave a sharp laugh. "You think you command me?" "I think this land has seen enough reckless choices," Storm replied. "The railroad pushes farther every month. The tribes push back. If you hang him, you light a fire that won't stay small." Kane's eyes flashed. The fire's already burning. That much was true. Serafina had seen it in small ways. Supply wagons arriving half empty. Settlers whispering about stolen cattle. Tribal families forced from riverbanks where their ancestors had fished for generations. The West was changing, and nobody agreed on how it should look when it was done. Thunderhawk shifted against the rope, his voice steady despite his position. "My people did not seek war. We sought respect." Kane snapped back. "Respect does not steal rifles." Storm Vance stepped closer to the water's edge, hands loose at his sides. "Maybe not," he said, "but desperation does." Serafina felt the baby press hard again, and a sharp discomfort forced her to breathe slowly. She steadied herself against the tree trunk. Thunderhawk noticed instantly. "You should sit," he said to her, concern cutting through his own danger. Kane scoffed. "He plays the hero well." Storm's gaze narrowed slightly at Kane. "You underestimate what a man fights for when his home is threatened." Serafina looked from one man to another, sensing layers beneath their words. Kane's authority did not come from law alone. It came from fear of losing control. The railroad paid men like him to keep supply lines safe, to keep resistance quiet. If Thunderhawk had truly led raids, then he had struck at more than wagons. It struck at pride and profit, and Storm Vance, standing between sides, seemed to understand both. "I heard about Red Hollow," Storm said suddenly. Thunderhawk's eyes darkened. "Then you know?" Serafina glanced at him, waiting. Storm continued, his voice carrying weight. "A settlement promised safe passage to your tribe in exchange for signing away grazing land. After the papers were signed, soldiers arrived anyway." Kane stiffened. "Rumors?" "My cousin was there," Thunderhawk said quietly. "He did not survive." The air thickened. Even Iron Coal shifted uncomfortably. Serafina felt anger stir within her, slow but fierce. She had grown up believing in the promise of the frontier, in hard work and fair trade. But promises broken by those in power changed everything. "That does not justify raiding," Kane insisted, though his voice lacked the certainty it once held. Thunderhawk met his gaze. "It explains it." Storm Vance stepped forward one more pace. You hang him, and you turn him into a martyr. You cut him down and bring him to town, and maybe you still have a chance at peace. Cain hesitated. That hesitation was enough to show cracks in his resolve. Serafina saw it and felt hope flicker. Not safety, not resolution, but a shift. Then Iron Cole spoke, surprising them all. My brother works the rail line, he said. Writes that even some of the workers think it's gone too far. Land taken without fair pay, promises made too quick. Cain shot him a warning look. Careful. I'm just saying, Iron Cole continued, voice low. Maybe we ain't the only ones who've done wrong. Silence followed. The prairie seemed to wait for Cain's next move. The creek kept flowing, steady and indifferent. Somewhere far off, a coyote called. Serafina felt Thunderhawk's presence beside her, strong even in restraint. She realized she was no longer simply defending a stranger. She was defending the possibility of a different future. For her child. For this land. Storm Vance's eyes flicked once more toward the ridge behind him, as if expecting others to appear. Cain slowly lowered his rifle, but he did not sling it over his shoulder. This isn't finished, he said. It's not by a long shot. Thunderhawk's wrists strained against the rope, still bound, still vulnerable. Serafina tightened her grip on the knife hidden at her side. The night finally settled over the prairie, wrapping them all in shadow. And though no one moved to fire another shot, the conflict only deepened, stretching beyond the creek, beyond the rope, into the very heart of the American West that none of them yet knew how to save. Night settled fully over the prairie, wrapping the cottonwood tree, the creek, and the gathered riders in deep blue shadow. A thin moon rose above the horizon, casting silver light across the restless water. The tension did not ease with the darkness. It sharpened. Mercy Cain sat tall in his saddle, his rifle lowered, but not forgotten. Storm Vance stood near the creek bank, boots planted firm, as if he were the only man not afraid of what might happen next. Iron Cole kept glancing between them, torn in ways he had likely never admitted aloud. Thunderhawk still hung bound, the rope creaking softly whenever he shifted his weight. Serafina stood close enough to feel the warmth of him, close enough to sense his strength even in restraint. Her hand remained hidden at her side, fingers wrapped around the knife. The prairie wind moved through the tall grass like a whispering crowd. You speak of peace, Cain finally said, his voice lower now but no less firm. Peace does not come from weakness. The railroad is coming whether you like it or not. Towns will rise. Law will follow. And whose law? Thunderhawk asked calmly. Law written by men who have never listened to this land? Storm Vance watched them both, his expression unreadable. This land is changing, he said. But how it changes is still in our hands. Serafina felt a tightening low in her back and drew a slow breath. The baby was restless again, as if sensing that its future was being argued over in the dark. She pressed her palm against her belly and looked at Thunderhawk. In the moonlight, his features seemed carved from stone, proud and unbroken. You cannot leave him like this, she said, her voice steady though her heart raced. If you claim to stand for law, then act like it. Cain's gaze shifted to her again. For a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes. Not cruelty, not doubt, something closer to calculation. You would defend him this fiercely? Cain asked. You barely know him. Serafina lifted her chin. I know what it is to lose a home. I know what it is to bury someone because of decisions made by men who never saw the cost. Silence followed her words. The mention of loss carried weight no one could dismiss. Storm Vance glanced at her with quiet respect. Thunderhawk's eyes softened in a way that made her breath catch. There was something growing between them in the middle of danger. Not reckless, not sudden, but steady. It's like a spark protected from the wind. Iron Cole finally dismounted, boots crunching on gravel as he stepped toward Cain. We can take him in, he said. Bind his hands proper, put him on a horse. If he runs, that's on him. But this right here, this ain't justice. Cain exhaled slowly, studying the scene. The prairie night seemed to hold its breath. From somewhere beyond the ridge came the faint echo of distant hoofbeats. Storm Vance heard it first. His head turned sharply toward the sound. You're not the only ones who know how to track, he said quietly. Thunderhawk's posture shifted. Even bound, he seemed to grow taller. My people will not leave me, he said. Cain cursed under his breath. How many? enough, Thunderhawk replied. The distant hoofbeats grew clearer, blending with a rustle of grass. Shapes began to form along the ridgeline, dark figures against the moonlight. Riders, silent and swift. Seraphine's pulse thundered in her ears. The conflict that had hovered like a storm cloud was finally breaking open. If Cain's men fired, there would be no turning back. If Thunderhawk's tribe charged, the prairie would witness another chapter of blood and bitterness. Stormvance stepped forward quickly. Everyone, lower your weapons, he commanded. Cain hesitated, torn between pride and practicality. His men shifted nervously. Iron Cole's hand hovered near his holster but did not draw. The riders on the ridge began descending, spreading out in a wide arc. They did not shout. They did not rush.
Ow.
Their silence was more powerful than any war cry. Seraphina felt Thunderhawk's presence beside her like a steady flame. They come for you, she whispered. They come for justice, he answered. The word carried new meaning now. One rider broke slightly ahead of the others, a tall woman with braided hair and a posture as strong as any warrior. She rode with grace and authority, a rifle strapped across her back, but her hands resting calmly on the reins. Her name carried across the wind before she spoke. Ravencrest, Thunderhawk murmured, relief flickering in his eyes. Ravencrest stopped her horse at the edge of the creek, her gaze sweeping across Cain's men. Release him, she said, her voice clear and steady. We did not come for war, but we will not leave without him. Cain straightened in his saddle. He stands accused of raiding supply lines. Ravencrest did not flinch. Your men stand accused of breaking treaties. The air between them tightened like a drawn bow. Stormvance stepped slightly between the two sides. This does not need to turn into a battlefield, he said firmly. You all know what happens if it does. The railroad will send soldiers. Soldiers will not ask questions. The truth of that hung heavy. Seraphine's mind raced. If violence broke out, she would be trapped in the middle. Her child, her future, all of it balanced on the choices made in the next few breaths. Thunderhawk looked down at her, his expression fierce, yet tender. You should step back, he said softly. Whatever happens next will not be small. She met his gaze. Neither is what we stand for. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to just the two of them. The rope, the riders, the arguments all faded into the background. She saw not a bound warrior, but a man of loyalty and courage, a man who fought not for glory, but for his people. And he saw not a frightened widow, but a woman of strength who had chosen compassion over fear. The distant riders of Ravencrest spread wider, their horses forming a protective crescent. Cain's men shifted nervously, counting numbers, measuring odds. Iron Cole stepped forward again, louder this time. We don't want this fight, he said. None of us do. Cain's jaw worked as he weighed his authority against the reality unfolding before him. Pride battled reason across his face. The rope above Thunderhawk creaked again in the night air. Seraphina felt another sharp wave of discomfort and steadied herself against the tree. Stormvance noticed and moved closer, his voice low. You cannot stay in the center of this. I am already in it, she replied. The prairie wind rose suddenly, sweeping through grass and water alike. Horses stamped and snorted. Hands tightened on reins and rifles, though none were raised yet. Ravencrest's gaze locked with Cain's. Release him, she repeated, her tone leaving no doubt. Cain slowly reached toward his saddle horn, his eyes never leaving hers. The hoofbeats had stopped. Every rider waited. Seraphina tightened her grip on the knife one final time. The next choice would decide whether this night became legend for peace or for tragedy. And in the breathless silence before that choice was made, the entire American West seemed to lean in. Waiting to see which way the future would turn, the prairie held its breath as Mercy Cain's hand hovered near his saddle horn. The moonlight caught the hard lines of his face, and for a long moment no one moved. The wind whispered through the tall grass, brushing against Seraphine's skirt, stirring Thunderhawk's dark hair, rippling the surface of the creek as if the land itself waited for the decision. Cain looked from Ravencrest to Stormvance, then to the line of warriors fanned out behind her. He counted them. He measured the distance. I understood finally that if he chose pride over reason, this quiet stretch of frontier would not remain quiet for long. The railroad would answer with soldiers. The tribes would answer with fury. The fragile hope of peace would be buried beneath another layer of bitterness. Iron Cole stepped closer to him, his voice low but steady. "It ain't worth it," he said. "Not tonight." Serafina felt another deep ache in her back and steadied herself, refusing to let weakness show. Thunderhawk's eyes never left her, even bound. Even at the mercy of others, his concern was for her safety. That truth struck Kane harder than any argument. Slowly, deliberately, Mercy Kane swung his leg over his horse and dismounted. Gravel crunched beneath his boots as he walked toward the cottonwood tree. Every rider watched him. Every heart beat in rhythm with his steps. He stopped in front of Thunderhawk and studied him up close for the first time that night. No rope, no weapon, no accusation could hide the strength in the warrior's posture or the dignity in his gaze. "You burn another wagon," Kane said quietly, "and I will not stand between you and what comes." Thunderhawk held his eyes. "You break another promise, and I will not stand aside." It was not forgiveness. It was not surrender. It was something more honest. An understanding. Kane reached up and pulled a knife from his belt. The blade flashed in the moonlight. Serafin's breath caught as he cut through the rope. The coarse fibers snapped, and Thunderhawk dropped heavily to his knees before catching himself on steady hands. Ravencrest exhaled slowly from across the creek. Storm Vance relaxed his stance, though his eyes remained watchful. Thunderhawk rose to his full height, rubbing his wrists. For a heartbeat, it seemed the night might shift again toward violence. But instead, he stepped forward and extended his hand to Kane. The gesture stunned them all. Kane stared at the offered hand. Then, after a long pause, he took it. The handshake was brief, but firm. A line drawn not in blood but in warning and possibility. The warriors behind Ravencrest did not cheer. They did not boast. They simply watched, understanding that this was only the first step in a long road toward balance on the American frontier. Storm Vance stepped forward. "This land has room for more than one future," he said. "But only if men choose courage over fear." Serafina felt tears sting her eyes, not from weakness but from relief. The child within her shifted again, strong and steady. She realized she'd been holding her breath since the first gunshot. Ravencrest guided her horse across the creek and approached Thunderhawk. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice softer now. "Your people wait beyond the ridge." Thunderhawk nodded. They will not need to fight tonight." His gaze turned to Serafina. In the moonlight, there was no distance between them. The prairie, the railroad, the conflict between settlers and tribal warriors all seemed to fade for a single, fragile moment. "You stood for me," he said quietly. "I stood for what felt right," she answered. Storm Vance noticed the way they looked at one another and allowed himself the smallest smile. "The frontier changes men," he said, almost to himself. "Sometimes it changes them for the better." Mercy Kane returned to his horse, mounting with less swagger than before. "I will speak to the rail office," he called out. "There will be talk. There will be resistance. But I will speak." It was more than anyone had expected from him. Iron Cole gave Serafina a respectful nod before riding back to Kane's side. Something in his expression had shifted too. The conflict had not ended, but the blind certainty had. Ravencrest turned her horse back toward the ridge. The warriors began to withdraw, not in retreat but in quiet solidarity. Thunderhawk did not follow immediately. He remained where he was, facing Serafina. "Should not ride alone at night," he said gently. She smiled faintly. "I have done harder things." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the cool air. "When your child is born," he said, "this land will still be changing. I cannot promise peace. But I can promise that my people will remember this night, and mine will too," she replied. For a moment, neither spoke. The prairie seemed softer now, less like a battlefield and more like the wide, living land it had always been. The creek continued its steady flow, indifferent to human struggle, yet witness to human courage. Thunderhawk reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. She did not. His hand rested lightly over hers, over the curve of her belly. The gesture was careful, reverent. "Life is stronger than conflict," he said. She looked up at him, seeing not just a warrior, but a man shaped by loyalty, loss, and love for his people. "Then let that be what guides us." In the days that followed, the story of that night traveled through the trading post, across rail camps, and through tribal villages. It became a quiet legend of frontier justice tempered by mercy, of a hanging stopped before it became tragedy. Mercy Kane kept his word and argued for negotiation rather than retaliation. Stormvance carried messages between both sides, pushing for understanding. Ravencrest ensured her people held to restraint while talks began. Change did not come easily. The American West was still rough, still divided. But a small shift had taken place beneath the cottonwood tree by the creek. Weeks later, when Seraphina gave birth in her small farmhouse beneath the wide prairie sky, Thunderhawk stood outside with Stormvance, waiting with the nervous patience of a man who had faced battle but never something so fragile. When the cry of new life filled the air, it echoed across the fields like a promise, a child born into a land learning to choose peace over pride. Thunderhawk entered quietly, his powerful presence softened by awe. Seraphina lay tired but radiant, the newborn wrapped in a blanket stitched with both settler cloth and tribal beadwork, a symbol of two worlds beginning to weave together. He knelt beside her, not as a warrior or a symbol, but as a man. "The frontier will remember this child," he said. Seraphina looked at him with warmth and certainty, and let it remember that love was stronger than fear. Outside, the prairie stretched endless and golden beneath the rising sun. The railroad would continue to lay its tracks. Tribes would continue to protect their heritage. Conflicts would still rise. But now there was a story carried by both sides of a night when guns were lowered, ropes were cut, and loyalty met compassion beneath the American sky. And in that wide, changing land, hope took root.